Good morning students, fourth year طلاب المرحلة الرابعة. الآن عندكم محاضرة جديدة عن الشعر الحديث modern poetry 20th century poetry. You know that we are moving in a chronological order. In the previous years we studied the poetry of the 16th, 17th century. Last year you studied the 18th and part of the 19th, and this year you studied also the late 19th century, the mid and the late 19th, which was the Victorian poetry. And now we are going to move to the modern poetry, which is mostly related to the 20th century poetry. And now we are going to see a kind of poetry which is or let's say it speaks about topics and themes which are close to our time. We are now moving to a period of time which is much closer to our time than the previous poetry that you have studied. Now you will see that you are familiar with the subjects and topics that this poetry talks about. Modern poetry, the 20th century, introduction. طبعا انتوا عندكم بالملزمة مقدمة اللي هي صفحة 27 للشعر الحديث. بعد ما خلصنا الشعر الفيكتوري راح نحاول ناخذ خلينا نقول نبذة مختصرة عن العصر الحديث وخصوصا الشعر الحديث. يعني شنو الأشياء اللي هنقول كانت مؤثرة، شنو اكو خصائص معينة بالعصر الحديث اللي ممكن نشوف انعكاسها على الشعر بشكل عام. So modern poetry, the 20th century poetry. Let's see the term itself. Which term? What term do you mean? I'm talking about the term modernism. When we speak about modern times, when we say modern poetry, when we say modern novel, modern drama, this year you are studying modern literature, whether it is drama, poetry, or let's say novel. What does this mean? Why we call literature modern or modernism in itself? What does it mean? Here the definition says modernism is the term given to the aesthetic movement. Aesthetic, here aesthetic means يعني بالعربي معناها جمالية، باعتبار احنا نتكلم عن الفن أو الأدب. Aesthetic movement dated from 1914 to 1945 that questioned the ideals of British Victorianism and reflected both the material and the psychological devastation of the two world wars. So when we speak about modernism, when we speak about modern age, we are talking about let's say a historical period, not only a literary period. There are things which are related to history, major events, like for example the world wars. I think you are so familiar with the world wars, the first one and the second one. The first one happened in the let's say it started in the 1914 and it ended in 1918. You see, so wars are not a usual event. They have a very huge influence on people, whether on the psychological level, whether on the social, economic, political. They change societies. There are countries, for example, which used to exist before war, and after war they doesn't exist anymore. Sorry, they don't exist anymore. So wars are devastating. They change societies. They change the world. Let's say maybe in a more negative way. So these wars had a huge influence not only on the ordinary life but also on literature. The literature that was written in this period reflected all these problems, all these changes that happened. And in order to express these new, let's say, psychological and material changes, the old forms of literature are not enough. The poets, the writers, they saw that they need to look for new ways, new techniques, because the traditional forms, they cannot actually express the new feelings, the new ideas, the new, let's say, disorders, the new destruction. It needs a new language, it needs a new methods, new ways of expression. So here modernism also, let's say, it signifies a break with some of the traditional bases of the Western art and culture. So the poets and writers, they saw that the new, let's say, the new culture needs new tools to express it. This is kind of a break. هنا break طبعا مو بمعنى تحطم، هنا break بمعنى انفصال. يعني الأدب أو طرق التعبير المعتادة اللي كانت موجودة في الأدب، نقول بالعصر الفيكتوري اللي احنا درسناه، كان آخر شي درسناه، صارت يعني ما تكفي للتعبير عن الأفكار الجديدة. That's why the Western art and culture, they try to have new ways of expression. The world wars had shaken faiths in the morality and coherence of the Western civilization. Why would wars have such a tremendous and huge influence on societies? Because one of the main things that people start to disbelieve in is the moral values of the traditional world. Because in wars, what happened? In wars we have let's say atrocities, killing. People are being killed on massive scales. For example, it is reported that in these wars almost 50, I think, million people were killed. So soldiers, for example, those who go to fight in the front lines, in the battles, they come back with different kinds of psychological disorders. Why? Because they have seen scenes of killing. They have seen their own, let's say, fellow soldiers or their friends being killed or tortured in the front of their eyes. So all these things have shaken people's faith in any kind of moral code which existed before. They saw that these moral codes, they did not fulfill what they promised. يعني كانوا يشوفون انه بسبب هذه خلينا نقول الاشياء الفظيعة اللي شافوها الناس واختبروها بالحرب. طبعا الحرب هي عبارة عن شنو؟ قتل وتعذيب، وأحيانا القتل يكون بأبشع الطرق. لذلك كان هذا له أثر كبير على إيمان واعتقاد الناس بالقيم الأخلاقية اللي كانت موجودة في المجتمع. Okay, so the world wars, we can consider them to be one of the major influences on the emergence of modern poetry. Modern poetry owes so much of its ideas, themes, concepts, images, expressions to the society, to the aftermath of the world wars, to the society which emerged in the let's say after the end of these wars. Now we come to important features of the modern poetry. يعني خلي شوي نخصص كلامنا أكثر عن الأدب، وخصوصا أكو بعض السمات الأساسية المهمة اللي تميز العصر الحديث. Important features. Let's say what are these important features. Now let's see poetry. What did poetry focus on? Focusing on imagery in poetry. هسا واحد بيكون يقول زين احنا قبل كنا دائما بالشعر نقول الشعر اللي كنا ندرسه imagery. We have images. Now we are more focused on imagery. يعني عندنا imagery كما كان في السابق، ولكن صار اكو تركيز اكبر عليها. يعني شنو تركيز؟ Let's see what does this word mean. Which means instead of describing images in great details with many words like the traditional poets did, the poet prefers to describe things with simple and a few words, or employs symbols to express themes. So instead of having, let's say, maybe a poem which is written in 2 pages, it is filled with images which describe, let's say, a certain theme or idea. Instead of that, Instead of using a lot of expressions and words to describe a certain scene, what does the poet do? Instead of that, he just put images and he leaves it to the reader to understand what these images talk about. يعني مجرد بس يخلي لنا صور بالقصيدة، صور شعرية طبعا، وأني كقارئ المفروض أفهم، أو أني لازم أستنتج أو أفهم المعاني اللي تكون المقصودة من هاي الصور. So here let's see imagery, let's say, or the focus on image is called Imagism. We have a movement here, a literary movement, which is related to the modern age, which is called Imagism. لاحظوا هي نفس كلمة image مع إضافة ISM, Imagism. So it is a movement founded by the American poet Ezra Pound. This is Ezra Pound. You see, this is his image. So what does this movement say? In Imagist poetry, the writer does not talk about the themes behind the images. They let the image itself be the focus of the poem. Just give you an image and then let your imagination, or let's say your ability to understand and to interpret the image, it depends on the reader. So one of the main features of modern literature and modern poetry in general is that it makes the reader has a major role in understanding and in analyzing the poem. So according to Pound, there are 3 rules for Imagist poetry. إذا اختصر لنا ياهن خلاهن 3 قواعد أساسية. Number 1, direct treatment of the subject. So if you are talking about a certain topic, certain subject, you can't relate this topic to any other let's say theme or idea. You just speak about one direct specific object. Number 2, use as few words as possible. So don't explain or describe or use a lot of expressions in order to show your subject. Just few words which can clearly express what you are talking about. Number 3, create new rhymes instead of relying on the old boring ones. You see, this is a feature which you can find not only in Imagist poetry, but let's say in modern poetry in general, which is called, sometimes we call it a free verse. Poetry which does not follow any rules concerning the form. You remember in the previous years when we used to study fixed forms of poems. For example, the sonnet. The sonnet was 14 lines. It is composed of 14 lines. The first 8 lines are different in the rhyme scheme than the last 6 lines. So you see, this is a fixed form. For example, we have the lyric, we have the heroic couplet, we have different traditional forms which are usually, as we studied them, they are usually following a strict rhyme scheme, a fixed one. But here in modern poetry, let's say modern poets and writers, let's say poets, because we are talking about poetry, they did not like to just be sticking to these old, and they consider them to be boring rhyme schemes. They wanted to experiment in new rhymes, free rhymes. يعني احنا حتى إذا بعضكم ممكن حتى يكون عنده فكرة عن هذا الشيء، احنا نسميه الشعر الحر، اللي هو ممكن ما يتبع البحور الشعرية التقليدية. Other features, let's say other features that we can find, or let's say movements which characterize the modern age. We have the avant-garde. Avant-garde, this is a French term. هذا فد مصطلح فرنسي. What does this mean, avant-garde? طبعا هو بالترجمة ممكن يطلع لكم الرواد أو النخبة أو شيء من هذا القبيل. A group of writers who deliberately undertook the task of making poetry new. Notice this here. They think that this is a task that they should be doing, making poetry new. But how do they plan to make poetry new? By violating, يعني من خلال خرق, by violating the conventional tradition and propriety. propriety هنا المقصود بها الحشمة, not only in art but also in social discourse. So what does this mean? It means that now in the modern poetry we find that poets, they are not afraid to speak about some kind of forbidden subjects, taboos يسموها taboo. إذا تردون أكتب لكم إياها هنا, تابو يعني المحرمات, بعض المواضيع اللي هي تعتبر من غير اللائق أنه يتم الحديث عنها بشكل صريح. You see subjects like, for example, sexuality, sometimes even religious topics, things that in society, in the social discourse, they used to be forbidden from being talked about publicly. What we see that in this new movement, they wanted to speak about them. They find that this is the way of making poetry new, by breaking the old conventional ways of talking about just things that society allows you to talk about. Now you are free to talk about whatever you like to speak. Other thing which characterizes the modern times and modern poetry is what we call postmodernism. إذا تلاحظون هي modernism بس نخلي لها قبلها prefix which is post. postmodernism. What do you mean by postmodernism? يعني ما بعد الحداثة. أكو حداثة وعندنا شيء اسمه ما بعد الحداثة. Is often applied to the literature and art after the Second World War from the 1939 to 1945. يعني شوفوا كل حرب, طبعا هو صحيح احنا نتكلم عن تأثير الحروب بشكل عام, ولكن طبعا كل حرب لها تأثير ممكن مختلف عن الحرب الأخرى. يعني الحرب العالمية الثانية تأثيرها أيضا كان لها وقع أو تأثير كبير جدا مثل الأولى, which was greatly influenced by the effect of the Nazi totalitarianism. طبعا إذا تعرفون كلكم, معظمكم يعرفون أنه بالحرب العالمية الثانية كانت عندنا الأنظمة الشمولية اللي كانت هي تعتبر محور الشر, كانوا يسموها محور الشر. عندنا النظام النازي في ألمانيا, عندنا نظام الفاشي في إيطاليا موسوليني, وكان عندنا أيضا اليابان. هذه الثلاث دول كانت تسمى محور الشر, وهي اللي كانت ضدها تحارب دول الحلفاء المتمثلة ببريطانيا وأمريكا وفرنسا وغيرها. So you see here the influence of the Nazi totalitarianism, يعني شمولية, wars and mass killings on the morale of the Western culture. So actually it is really difficult to define postmodernism, but still it is one of the main features of modern, let's say modern times. Other movements resist classification and they stress the meaningless of existence. يعني لاحظوا هنا in modern society there are many existential problems, أو حتى نقدر نسمي هاي الفترة أو هاي المشكلة بشكل عام نقدر نسميها existentialism, الوجودية. There is a kind of crisis, a psychological crisis, a philosophical crisis that started to appear in society. Like, for example, modern man started to question the meaning of existence. Why would let's say a man who is doing all these killings and murders and torturing, what is the meaning of life, of such a life in which we have all this suffering and humiliation that people suffer from? فصارت أكو بعض الأسئلة الوجودية اللي طبعا نتج عنها أو انعكست، خلينا نقول وين انعكست في الأدب وأدت إلى ظهور حركات أصلا مبنية على فكرة معنى الوجود أو عبثية الوجود. Like what? Like absurdism. And I think you are studying this in drama. You are studying the theater of the absurd in drama, or maybe you studied that, but I think this is an important feature in modernism that every student of modernism should study. And we have surrealism. So so we see, if we keep talking about the influences and the movements that appeared in modernism, actually there are a lot of details, but here we are trying to take just a a brief idea. Let's see what kind of techniques we are going to see. What kind of techniques we have? Techniques in literature which are mainly taken or appeared because of these influences, or let's say because of these developments that we find in literature. One of the main, let's say, techniques that we can find in literature, in modern literature, whether poetry, drama, or novel, the stream of consciousness, اللي هو يسمونه باللغة العربية تيار الوعي. Stream of consciousness. It refers to a technique in narration whereby the author writes as though inside the minds of the characters. So instead of just having a narrator who speaks about the events, about the characters, who introduce to us everything about the story, we have let's say, as readers, we are living inside the mind of the character. We can see what the character is thinking about. Since the ordinary person's mind jumps from one event to another, this technique tries to capture this stream of ideas. So here the writers, they see that the real thing that a writer should be communicating to the reader is the inside of the character, not the actions of the character. So instead of following the course of actions that the character does, we are following these streams of ideas. Another technique here that I think we are going to see in the poems that we will study, we have fragmentation. Fragmentation, from the word fragment. You know, fragment, the poet uses bits and pieces of images and expressions, sometimes even broken sentences, to stress the confusion and the psychological disorders of the characters. So sometimes when you read a modern novel or even a modern poem, you find it really difficult to follow what the character is saying. Sometimes, why? Because the poet is trying to show you that the character is really confused. So how can he show this to you? Instead of saying that the character is confused, he makes the character speak with broken sentences, with just pieces of expressions. So when you read such let's say such a text which is written in this technique, you can think, or you can understand, or sometimes you can even feel how the character is really having a kind of confusion. It can't express itself easily. Maybe there are some psychological disorders which influence the ability of the character to express itself. So instead of telling you about this, the poets and the writers, they show you this through the use of the technique of fragmentation. We are going to see if any poems that we will study have such techniques. Now we come to one of the main features of modernism, which is psychoanalysis. Psychology in general is a new branch of knowledge. Psychoanalysis, which was introduced by Sigmund Freud. I guess you are all familiar with Sigmund Freud. It tries to study the psyche of man, and it divides this psyche into the conscious and the subconscious, and then there are many actually details which are related to the interpretation of dreams, how let's say the dreams express the desires which the person was not able to attain in reality. That's why their dreams, the interpretation of dreams, could help us understand the psyche of the characters. Some writers and poets actually made use of this new trend, the psychoanalysis, and they tried to make a psychoanalysis of their characters. It was kind of a means for them to access the individual's inner self. And of course, when we speak about modernism, there are a lot of things which are related, let's say, to pollution, to the environment, the changes in the climate, the changes in economy, the rise of capitalism. You see, this is one of the features in modern age. All these things affected poetry, literature, and poetry in general, in which we can find reflected in the poems of, let's say, our selected poems that we are going to study. We will see that maybe the main idea or the main theme which would be common between all the poems is the search for meaning. All the poets are trying to show this urge, this desire of the modern man to reach to a certain meaning for life, because of the huge disturbance and psychological confusion and disorder which happened in the modern times. So this is in brief modern, an introduction to modern poetry. If you have any questions, you are welcome to ask at any time. Thank you so much.